So that's really all it took, huh? I mean, I'm not saying the Moondrop Para 2 is just a Moondrop Para 1 with pads from a Cosmo, but it kind of is, and well, it kind of works. Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and today we're taking a look at the Moondrop Para 2. This is Moondrop's latest planar magnetic driver headphone, a 100mm planar, coming in at a price of $500 US. Now, if you're paying attention, this is the follow-up to the original Para, which actually launched at a price point of $300. Now, post-tariffs, it's $350, but $500 is a bit of a steep jump for this headphone, just kind of right out the gate. And at least on paper, it does kind of look like they just took the Moondrop Para, took the pads from the Cosmo, and they added $150 to the price tag. But is that all that this thing actually is? Or is there more to it? And I guess, is that recipe enough to make it worth $500? Well, for the past couple of weeks, I've been living with and listening to the Moondrop Para 2, comparing it to a bunch of other headphones that you can get for around $500 and even some less. And I'm ready to let you know what I think. I guess before we get into that, a quick shout out to Shenzhen Audio for sending the Para in for review. I've got them linked in the description down below if you want to check it out. But with that said, let's go to the table. We'll talk about what you get inside the box of the Para 2. We'll talk about the build quality, fit and comfort, all that stuff. And then of course, we will talk about the sound of this headphone and how it compares with those other headphones that I've alluded to, but I guess I haven't named yet. We'll keep that one in our back pocket. But here's the box. Here's the, it's too big. I can't put it on the screen. Even here next to my head, it's a little bit large. But if you wanted to see the artwork in all its glory, it does, like Moondrop typically does. It does include a little postcard-ish. It doesn't have a place for you to write the address like some other postcards have in the past. But anyway, it's got some artwork in the box, which you can enjoy if you'd like. On the topic of the box also includes another box, which is actually kind of a nice little carry case. This is actually the exact same size as the box itself. The box basically just acts as a cardboard wrapper around this carry case. And well, as you can see, it's kind of too large for me to even show you here on the camera, but it's got a foam insert that holds the headphone itself in place. And then it's got a little folder spot over there, which is, I don't know, I think that's actually kind of a nice inclusion. The original Para did not include any sort of carry case. In fact, none of Moondrop's headphones like this have included this carry case. So I'm kind of digging it. It's just like, it's like the perfect size for this headphone, for this box. And I think it's a smart inclusion. Now, apart from that, you do get the headphone, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but I also wanted to talk about, let's start with this cable. Okay, it comes with a little baggie to hold your cable, but let's dig into the build quality on this cable because I've got some issues personally. I don't like this cable. This is the worst cable Moondrop has ever included with one of their headphones. And I don't get it because I just got one of their cheaper headphones, the Moondrop Horizon, and that one came with a much better cable. Out of the box, this thing is just so not what I am into. As you might be able to tell here, all right, here's why I don't like it. It is a flat ribbon cable, which just means that the behavior on it is going to be all sorts of annoying when it comes to winding up the cable and putting it away, which I guess, okay, maybe that's not your primary use case for a cable, but it is nonetheless something that drives me nuts. I'm not a big fan of ribbon cables at all. Can you tell? You could probably tell. All right, I won't say that again. The other things I don't love about this cable is that it does terminate into 4.4 mil balance, which I know some people like 4.4 mil balance. That's fine, I suppose. I like the cables where you have a swappable termination, like the one that comes with the Horizon, for example. Again, they're cheaper headphone. But this, instead of having a swappable termination, it has just a pigtail adapter, which no, this is not my ideal of a solution for 3.5. Here's what I'm gonna say. I flat out did not use this cable at all because this is no bueno for me. I don't know, you can make up your own mind if you are willing to accept this, but personally, I feel like Moondrop has just done such better cables with all of their other headphones. Literally every other headphone they've done has a better cable than this. I don't know why they're including this thing. But here you go, here's the Y split. It splits into two sides, which are also flat, as you can see, which is kind of annoying. But that does terminate into standard dual 3.5mm entry on the headphone side. So it is a standard connector. I've got plenty of alternative cables for this, so that's why I didn't use this cable. And there's a good chance that you also have replacements for this as well, because it is just a nice common connector. I guess the last note on this cable is that it is about probably like 5.5 feet long. It's maybe a little bit long for my personal taste. I usually prefer a 4-foot cable because I'm more of a portable boy, but I think I'm okay with 5 foot as like as a compromise with desktop users, but the flatness and the 4.4-ness of this thing, I'm not down with. But that will bring us into talking about the headphone itself, which, well, if you've seen Moondrop's other headphones, you're probably going to know exactly what I'm going to say about this headphone, which is it's in effectively exactly the same chassis, which has kind of all the same problems that it has had for a long time. Mostly it's just this headband. You can see how floppy it is, right? If I hold this headphone by one ear cup, you see how much sag you get out of this other ear cup because, well, it's not the lightest of headphones out there. It is a planar magnetic headphone, and magnets tend to be heavy. And, well, it just completely makes this headphone a very, very floppy kind of mess. It does, you can hold it together kind of hamburger style, I guess, like this, and it makes it feel a little bit more solid. But by default, the headband won't hold itself together like this. You can kind of bend it and torque it to get into a position where it will. But even if you do that, the rotation on these things is pretty stiff, so it doesn't really want to do that naturally. I feel like naturally, when I put this headphone down, all my handling of it is basically two-handed handling of it, and it just kind of sits back exactly in this orientation. So I don't know, small handling things, is that small? I don't know. For me, this stuff makes a big deal. Like, it just makes it's like the difference between me wanting to pick up and use a headphone and leave it on my desk versus kind of being annoyed by it every time I pick it up. And this one's unfortunately on the slightly more annoying side. Now, that's also, again, been true of their other headphones, including the Cosmo. And I am a big fan of the Cosmo. I put up with it with the Cosmo because, well, I like the sound of it. But does this one make up for it? We're going to talk about that, of course. Other things to talk about with the build quality in this thing. So they did make some visual changes to this. I'll pull in the Para 1 for comparison real quick. In case you're wondering, you're blinking, you're rubbing your eyes, are you making things up? No, this one is glossier. They added kind of like a shiny finish to it, like more like a stainless steel finish to it, whereas the Para and all of Moondrop's other headphones had more of this matte finish to it. To be honest, personally, I like the matte finish better, but that's going to be very much up to personal taste. I think the shininess might look a little bit fancier, might look a little bit more premium, but I feel like the finish on it is not the most even, and it just never really looks that premium to me. But it looks fine. I don't know. I don't hate the way this headphone looks. In fact, I kind of do like this grill pattern on the outside. I don't hate the stamp on the stamped holes in the headband, but I do not really like how big this headband is. We'll talk about more in the comfort bit, but yeah, I don't know. It's just it's kind of a big, heavy, floppy headphone, which has unfortunately not improved in terms of its ergonomics at all since this design came out. But what else can I talk about before I put this thing on my head? Let me highlight real briefly the pad situation here, because I've already alluded to this being basically a Moondrop Para with Cosmo ear pads. And these pads are, as far as I can tell, and I have a Cosmo sitting right next to me, exactly the same thing as the Cosmo pads, which are generally nice pads. They are made out of an actual sheepskin, which is kind of nice. And you can see that they've got a very wide opening on the inside, although they are a little bit on the shallow side up front. Down in the back, they're a little bit deeper. And generally, I'll say, I'll put this on my head and I'll show you, but I find that there's plenty of room in there for your ears. You're not going to have issues with that. But the other thing that's kind of cool about these ear pads, okay, I'm kind of alluded to the fact that they are angled, but I like that they are easily replaceable. You see that little mechanism I just did there? Basically, the pads wrap around this metal ring, and because the headphone is largely made out of magnets, the metal ring just kind of like snaps into place and it lets the ear pad fall on top of it, which I think is a pretty cool solution. I guess if I'm nitpicking this thing, as is the case with all of these Moondrop headphones, the metal ring is actually a little bit sharp on the outside. So if you're pad swapping with this thing, and it is like kind of a standard pad fitment with this little stretchable skirt that you can stretch over the lip of this metal ring, as you're doing these swaps, just be mindful of the sharpness of this metal ring, because, well, one, it might just be uncomfortable, but two, more importantly, it could start to cut into the material of the pad, and you don't want that happening. Not an issue if you're not doing pad swaps, but if you are, just keep that in mind. Apart from that, anything else to talk about this thing before I talk about comfort? Not really. So let's talk about comfort. And I'm actually going to start with going back to the headband real quick and just highlighting the fact that I am wearing this headphone on the absolute smallest size possible. and I do not have that small of a head. I would say my head size is probably like medium largish. So if you have a small head, this headphone's probably going to be too big for you, although there is kind of a solution. But yeah, basically, I don't know why they haven't fixed this yet, but they've got the suspension strap situation. They do have these adjustments on sliders, as you can see here. But all of these positions are completely useless because I'm going to say for like most people, probably 90% of people will never be able to lift this thing above the first spot. And that's just kind of silly for me. But here's the potential solution. If you've got an Allen key, and it is a very small Allen key, but you can see that there are screws here on this little mechanism. Unscrew this will kind of come apart into two pieces. And then the strap, you can actually flip it upside down. And I've got this one on the Para 1 installed this way just to kind of demonstrate for you how if you have the strap come down from the bottom of this mechanism rather than from the top, it actually effectively shortens the strap, and it also makes it fit just a lot more snug. Like I feel like this should just be, there's like no trade-off. Moondrop should just start doing this with the strap situation, because it's going to let you fit it. Look at that. I've got it in the middle of the adjustment slider rather than at the extreme bottom of the adjustment slider, which means this headphone's going to fit more people than this one will. But you know, I feel like that's kind of a small thing. You can fix that. I can fix that. I'm happy to, I suppose. Probably shouldn't need to on a $500 headphone, but it is what it is. Okay, anything else to talk about comfort before I throw this thing on my head? I'm just check my notes briefly. No, let's just do it. Throw it on the head, show you that it is kind of a large fitting headphone. Okay, it might look a little bit goofy depending on your sensitivity to looking silly, I suppose, but I don't know. Again, I kind of like the way that the grill is designed, even if I don't really love this glossy finish to it. But the bigger issue that I kind of want to highlight as I've got this thing on my head is the fit, because not only does it fit quite large, it also fits very loose. So it's like the kind of headphone, not that you do this a lot with a headphone, but you definitely can't do this with a headphone. Here's something else I actually had trouble doing with this headphone, drinking water. Like just tipping my head back enough to drink water is enough that this starts to feel unstable on the head and like it wants to fall off. So this is not the best solution. I would love to see Moondrop advance this, but maybe I have harped on this enough. So you can make up your own mind on whether or not that is acceptable. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like they can do better than this. I know Moondrop can do better than this, but there you go. I guess now we're going to talk about the sound on this headphone. And I did want to, while we're talking about the physical form factor, just kind of inquire this idea of, is this literally just a Moondrop Para, the original headphone, with pads from a Moondrop Cosmo? And as far as I can tell, physically, I can't see any differences, okay? Apart from the finish difference. I take off the pads and I look at the drivers, they look exactly the same. But if I do dig into their literature, their website description of the different headphones, there are slight differences in terms of how they describe some of the construction of this headphone. On this headphone, they highlight how thin the driver is. They don't have any specs for how thin it is on the original Para. They also do seem to specify a slightly different magnet. I don't know anything about magnet specification, so if you want to look at that, it's like an N55 versus an N52. That doesn't mean anything to me, but they are different numbers. But maybe most meaningful is that the sensitivity ratings on this are slightly different than the sensitivity ratings on the Para 1, which I guess could also be just down to pads, but I don't know. I think even like the impedance is a little bit different. So this is maybe a 9 ohm impedance and the other one's an 8 ohm impedance headphone. So slightly different, but does it actually sound different? That's what we're going to get into right now. And I'm going to tell you right now, it's also kind of similarly uncertain, but let's talk about that. Okay. Here's the frequency response of the Moondrop Para 2 as measured on my frequency response rig. If you want to take a look at this and compare it to literally 100 plus other headphones that I've measured, I've got it up on Squiglink, linked in the description down below. But let's talk about it together. And if you're familiar with the frequency response of the Moondrop Para, the original one, well, this is different. In fact, I don't normally do a whole lot of comparisons here in this section, but let's do it because we're talking about it. Here's the frequency response of the original Para. You can see that it had a much more forward kind of upper mid-range character, maybe a more normal mid-range. In fact, I would just say that the original Para was like actually a really well-tuned mid-range performer. Nice vocal-centric sound, maybe a little bit bright up in the upper treble, and the bass rolls off a little bit, but generally a pretty good sound. But you can see here that the Para 2 does in fact sound different. But what's interesting is that it sounds different in a lot of the ways that the Moondrop Cosmo sounds different from the Para. And in fact, as far as I could tell, if I actually take this headphone, or sorry, if I take the original Para, put these pads on the Para, I get nearly exactly the same frequency response. Like nearly exactly the same frequency response. So to the point that there are differences, but there are differences you could probably chalk up to unit variation if that is the case. But I will say that to my ear, there are some things I actually hear differently. It's not just placebo. It's something that I'm pretty confident I could hear in a blind test. But I'm actually getting ahead of myself a little bit. Let me go back to the squig and just kind of describe what we're looking at. We're looking at kind of a mid-rangey, neutral-ish sound signature. You can see it's a little bit relaxed up here in the upper mid-range. You can see it's got a bit of this hump kind of at 1K. So this all kind of contributes to having kind of like a softer, lower contrast mid-range tuning. It's not so much like a super vocal forward tuning, at least on paper, although I will say that the lower treble here in kind of like the presence region is relatively forward, and I think that gives the effect of actually bringing more focus to the vocal than you might expect of this sound signature, because again, it does have a little bit of a recess here, but I feel like kind of this hump here at like 1.5K plus this lower treble does end up making it sound a little bit more vocal focused than you might expect. Maybe even a little bit on the bright side. Now down here in the lower mid-range, you can see it's a little bit on the lean side, but the bass does extend nicely. I would not say that this is a bassy headphone. If you're looking for something that's bassy, that is warm and full and lush, it's not really exactly what the Para 2 is. You could maybe describe the mid-range as like somewhat on the warm side because of this slightly relaxed upper mid-range, but I do feel like, you know, this 1.5K hump plus the lower treble emphasis here does nonetheless kind of keep it sounding in the realm of bright and lean. Let's just go with that, bright and lean. Yeah. All right. So, but how does it actually sound to my ear? All right, that's what we're going to talk about now. I'll get into the comparisons with the Cosmo and the Para. We'll do some direct comparisons more so. But generally, I actually think this thing sounds really good. It sounds open. It sounds spacious. It has like a lot of room for the mid-range. That low contrastness of the mid-range just kind of gives it like this wide open kind of mid-rangey sound that is, again, not especially forward in like the vocal region. Like if I listen versus the Sennheiser HT600, for example, it very much sounds like the vocal is kind of fore of the rest of the music, which is not really the effect that you get here, but you nonetheless kind of get this highlighting of vocals. Maybe it's just because of that lower treble contrast or that lower treble highlight that, I don't know, it does it for me. I'll just say that. Yeah, maybe you could say that the imaging lacks a little bit of focus. It does have, again, kind of like a wide stereo image effect, but it's not going to be necessarily like the most like focused in terms of being able to pinpoint the position of things, if that's important for you. Again, the vocals are not very forward, but they do have a nice kind of shimmer and highlight to them. Generally, I think that it does sound a little bit on the bright side overall, but the emphasis is more in like the transient, so like guitar plucks and stuff like that. This definitely has some of that planar pluck that you might expect from, let's say, like a hyphen, right? Where it's got somewhat of an exaggerated treble presentation, but it's more so actually in like the lower and mid treble on this versus like the high treble. So it sounds, I think, more natural than something like the hyphens, and we'll get into that comparison a bit as well. And yeah, most of the emphasis just kind of sounds like it lands on the transients of things like guitar plucks and even like kick drums and stuff like that. I think that it avoids generally coming across as sharp. Maybe you could describe the upper treble as a little bit on the unnatural side, a little bit on the tinkling side, but the balance is generally pretty good in the treble. I guess I feel like I'm kind of saying both things about the treble, that it's a little bit bright and it's also a little bit, it's definitely not an easy treble, but I don't think that it ever comes across as sharp or sibilant or anything like that. So it's pretty well done. And then the other thing that I actually really did not expect in this headphone. Actually, let me just back up and say all of those things I just said about this headphone, you can kind of say about the Para with the Cosmo pads. Right? If I take the original Para, put the Cosmo pads on it, pretty much all of those things I could say because the frequency response is just about identical. The one thing I can't say, however, is the bass. Because the bass on this thing is actually really, really good. Whereas that's just a character that for some reason doesn't actually come across in the Para. At least my copy, I don't know if this is unit variation or if there are in fact some hardware differences behind them. But the bass is just a lot more satisfying here on the Para 2. It comes across as, again, it's not like a forward bass character, but it really does dig deep quite well. So things that have like a body and a heft behind them, but that are like kind of like polite. I'm trying to think of a specific example. There was some music I was listening to last night by an artist named, oh my gosh, I'm Marika Hackman or something like that. I apologize. New artist to me. I don't like to besmirch or like. Anyway, there was one track, and I wish I remembered the name of this track because there was like this really satisfying, like low, kind of effect in the bass, and it wasn't like especially loud or anything like that. It wasn't like this dominating characteristic in the sound, but when I listened to it on this headphone, like there was a really nice physicality behind it, whereas when I went back to the Para or even something like the HD600, that was lacking. And so that actually really stood out to me and made this, just kind of added like an extra layer of depth to the enjoyment of the sound in this headphone. Generally, I think this is actually a very good sounding headphone. Maybe not the most natural, but it generally, I don't know, it's just got kind of like a nice, easy sound about it while still being a little bit on the bright side, a little bit on the forward side, but having a satisfying bass character. So yeah, I dig this. But how does it compare to some other headphones, which we've already alluded to? Let me throw some things off my desk so I have some room to talk about them. And of course, we're going to start with the Moondrop Para 1, which I've kind of already talked quite a bit about how these things compare, at least how they compare using the same pads. But if I'm using the stock ear pads, which is this one right here, you can see it's different than the pad we have here on the Para 2. If I just take the stock sound of the Para 1, this is a more normal sounding headphone, at least more normal in like the sense of like Sennheiser HD600 mid-range. Like this sounds more forward in the vocals, sounds a little bit more natural to me overall. But it also comes across a little bit softer in the transients. Like there's just nothing really that stands out to me about the sound here on the original Para. This is a fine sounding headphone, but it nonetheless kind of leaves me flat. Like the bass isn't that great. The treble is fine. It's a little bit on the soft side again. Imaging does seem to get a little bit more narrow and a little bit like the stereo image, the sound stage, dare I say. On the Para 2, like it's got like this nice wide open sound, whereas with the Para 1, it does feel more focused, but it also feels more just kind of narrow and mundane, I suppose. I'll say that. I do prefer the sound generally here on the Para 2. Like it's just got more character. It's got a little bit more engagement factor, and then the bass is just a lot better on the Para 2. How much of it is the pads versus something else with the headphone? I think it is something with the headphone, something with the driver, the design. I don't know exactly, but yeah, the bass is quite nice on this thing, and that ends up being kind of the thing that I feel like separates them and elevates this to sounding better than this does to me. Does it sound $150 better? It's a good question. I'll leave that one for you, but I do enjoy this one more. So let me put that one to the side. I actually did want to talk about this other headphone because, well, here's another interesting comparison. I didn't pull up the frequency response of the Cosmo. Maybe we could, but what's interesting is that putting Cosmo pads on the Para makes the Para graph a lot like the Cosmo. Like so much of the tuning of these headphones is coming from the pads, and these two headphones are using the exact same pad. So do they sound exactly the same? Well, no, they don't actually. They sound, some similarities. I feel like the similarities actually stand out more in a graph than they necessarily stand out to me in my head. I think that kind of like wide open presentation of the mid-range is similar between the two. I think that is absolutely the case. But overall, the Cosmo sounds warmer. It sounds thicker and more lush and a little bit softer. And in some ways, it might even sound a little bit like lower resolution because it doesn't have quite that lower treble emphasis you get here on the Para 2, where this is adding a lot of contrast and you know, I'm going to say a lot of bite to transients, but it's a very pleasant bite. It's not, hey, take that how you will. It's not like an aggressive, sharp, abrasive bite. It's just, it adds a nice bite to it. Whereas the Cosmo's a little bit on the soft side. Transients are a little bit on the dull side. And that's kind of always been the case with this headphone. But it nonetheless has a character about it that I find just really, really satisfying. This is a headphone that invites me to listen louder than I would normally, which I don't know if I'm advising you do that, but it is nonetheless how I enjoy this headphone. Like I listen to Cigarettes After Sex, I crank it, and goddamn, this headphone sounds phenomenal. This sounds also really good and impressive, but maybe just a little bit less special than what you get here out of the Cosmo, which I know is like a very, I don't know, how do you quantify it sounds more special? I don't know. Because it's more expensive? Is that why I'm saying that? I don't think so. It is just a nice, unique, warm, lush, laid back, chill sound that you get here in the Cosmo. And that's not quite exactly what you get here on the Para 2. It is more of a, I would say more traditional sounding, but it does have its own character to it. And it is pretty pleasant in and of itself. Now, arguably, I would say that the bass might even be a little bit tighter here on the Para 2. I think that the bass comes across more thick on the Cosmo, probably because there's less of that lower treble energy. But the tightness of the bass on the Para 2 is actually pretty stinking nice. All right, anything else I want to talk about in this comparison? I don't think so. So let me put the Cosmo to the side, and we're going to pull in a couple of other headphones you've seen around here a number of times. But this is the Hyphaman Edition XS, and there's actually, from what I understand, a new edition headphone coming out soon, which might be the better comparison. But for now, this is what I've got, the Edition XS, and also a planar headphone. Price on this one used to be $500. You can now get it all day for under $300, so kind of a good value. And this comparison is tough. They don't really sound the same. Maybe you could say that like kind of that planar pluckiness in the transients that I described, you get here on the Cosmo, you definitely get that effect here, or sorry, on the Para. You definitely get that effect here on the Edition XS, where you don't really get that on the Cosmo or the original Para, to be honest. The original Para is not that plucky. But both of these have like that nice sharp transient that's really satisfying and a lot of fun. I do think that the vocal on this is more recessed than what you get on the Para 2. It sounds maybe a little bit stagier, a little bit more. I think that the imaging is generally like more precise. Whereas I described the sound on the Para 2 sounding wide, but maybe a little bit unfocused. I feel like the Edition XS sounds wide, but also still really well focused. The probably biggest complaint I would give you with the Edition XS in this comparison is that the upper treble can sound a little bit on the crunchy side. I don't really find it particularly fatiguing, but for certain instruments like I'm thinking of the tambourine crash in Fade Into You by Mazzy Star. It's a track I use a lot because that tambourine crash can be kind of annoying on certain headphones. On the Edition XS, it's not bad, but it's a little bit on the crunchy side and it's not that pleasant. I do think that on the Para, it does come across a little bit on the smoother side. I would say that the treble on this comparison, this is probably well, okay, I don't actually want to say that because I want to bring in this other headphone. And of course, you expected it, the Sennheiser HD600. Not a planar headphone. In fact, the only headphone I've shown you today that's not a planar. It's a dynamic driver headphone. And price on this is anywhere between $300 to $500, depending on where you buy it. But this has kind of been my go-to, and it's still going to be my go-to. I'll just say this. I'm probably biased in some ways because I just keep listening to this headphone and thinking, well, it just kind of blows everything out of the water. But in terms of my preferences for what I like, the mid-range forwardness on this thing is just fantastic. The texturing in the mid-range, the micro contrast, it is to die for. If you like listening to vocal content and just having this kind of like lifelike, transparent sense about it, while also having like a nice sense of body and physicality to it, the HD600 is just kind of unbeat. The Para 2's vocals are not bad. Like, they actually sound quite good here. And maybe of the bunch, well, I don't know if I want to say anything extreme, like this is the second best of the bunch, but I don't know. There's a satisfying character to the vocal presentation on this. Again, it's maybe more of like this wide presentation than it is so much this focused presentation, but it's pretty satisfying and it's enjoyable. I think that this is kind of what I was going to get into talking about with the treble on the Para 2. I think in terms of like the forwardness of the lower treble, these two are probably the most similar. I think that the HD600 does it overall smoother and also like more textured and more detailed to my ear, whereas the Para 2, I think, rides that line and it doesn't really get to the point of being crashy or sharp or anything like that, but it's a little bit closer to that edge and it's a little bit more unnatural sounding in the treble versus the HD600. Now, the benefit of that is that it might sound a little bit more exciting, a little bit more fun. The transients are going to be a little bit more exaggerated and kind of engaging in a way. But probably the biggest difference between these headphones in terms of like what you're likely to latch onto is going to be the bass, where the bass on this thing is just, it's awesome. I really quite like the bass on this. It's not a forward bass, just FYI. Like if you hear me talking about this bass, you're like, whoa, I got to hear that because I love bass. This is not like a really bass forward headphone, but the execution on it is just really good. That low bass character that I was talking about in that Marika Hackman song, it was more satisfying on this than it was on the HD600. But overall, I gotta say, I still prefer the HD600. Again, maybe I'm biased for this headphone, but it is what it is. But that will bring us into the conclusion of my review on this headphone. I'm gonna check my notes, make sure I'm not missing anything, and I don't think I am. Out of 5 stars, the Moondrop Para 2, I'm gonna give it a very solid 3 stars. If I'm just rating the sound on this thing, I'll probably give it 4 stars. But unfortunately, I do have to consider that the build quality in this thing is just kind of floppy and messy, and it really does interrupt my desire to listen to this headphone. I like the way it sounds. It sounds, frankly, better than most headphones at this price point. In fact, I would say, yeah, that was probably my 3rd favorite sounding headphone on this table. I like the sound of this better than the Edition XS as an overall general sounding headphone, even if it's maybe not quite as impressive in terms of its imaging performance. The bass performance is, I would say, equally impressive, if not more so. And the mid-range tonality is just a little bit more to my taste versus the Edition XS. But the Edition XS build quality doesn't drive me nuts like this one. So overall, I would still take the Edition XS. But if you want to check out the Para 2, of course, I've got it linked in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you haven't yet, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, join me on Discord, also linked down below. And I'll catch you in the next super review. Cheers.
Join with the force of reviews, we now have the tools to brave the misleading world of audio fools. Hey, this review is super, and so are you. Grab your headphones, sniff a graph, and share your thoughts in this pursuit. Let's begin with